again for coming. I'm very pleased to introduce our final lecture in this week's Running Visiting Scholar Series by Robert Fox, who is the Emeritus Professor of the History of Science at Oxford. And of course, as always, I thank Dr. Horning for his endowment, which makes all of this possible. I always thank Dr. Horning. Like, what a great guy. I wish I could have met him. And so most of you have been here before, so I won't go through the entire career again, but just a few highlights. Robert is former president of the British Society of the History of Science, has many, many honors, and has written many books mainly on science and technology in France in 18th and 19th centuries, including The Culture of Science in France, 1700 and 1900, Science Industry and the Social Order in Post-Revolutionary France. I always want to say pre-revolutionary. Yes. And most recently, just came out in Johns Hopkins' Savant on the State, Science and Cultural Politics in 19th Century France. And today, in continuing his theme of Science International, he will be talking about the legacy of a fractured world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming again. It's a great pleasure. It's been a huge honor for me. And I, again, want to add my thanks to Dr. Horning. I just wish I could have known him or even known more about him. So, The Legacy of a Fractured World is the title I chose for today. It begins just a few weeks into World War I, in October 1914, and a group of 93 German intellectuals published a patriotic manifesto. It was a call to the civilized world, the Kulturwelt. It was virulent and it caused a sensation. A sensation that some historians have said was still remembered at the time of the Second World War as well. It's a bigger event, I think, a more important document than you might think at first sight. The gist of it was that the Kaiser, this is what it said in the manifesto, in this statement, the Kaiser, the German government, the German people, they hadn't wanted the war. The war had been forced on Germany by the lies and calumnies with which our enemies are endeavouring to stain German honour. Well, what were the calumnies? That Germany had trespassed into neutral Belgium, had violated Belgian neutrality. Not so, says the manifesto. Not so, because Germany had simply acted to frustrate British and French plans to occupy the country. That German forces had gratuitously damaged the Cathedral of Louvain. Not so again. German actions were a strategic necessity in response to intolerable Allied provocation. What about German militarism, the German militarism that the Allies made so much of? Well, how else was Germany to protect her culture? And what comes across, I think, in this document is that the Germans who signed it saw the war as a culture war. How else was Germany to resist Allied attacks on the German spirit, the German soul? Well, among the 93, there were pretty well all the early 20th century German scientists you've ever heard of. Of the greats, there was only one name missing, and that was Einstein. Einstein was, I think, far too internationalist a figure to have accepted to sign this sort of document. Otherwise, they're all there. The document caused the storm it was calculated to provoke, and there followed a tide of mutual vilification. The Allied response was to present Germany as waging a profoundly racial war. The Germans, after all, were different from us. They thought differently. They even looked different. At least they looked different to the loyal French Alsatian artist and author Annecy. They're rather unflattering drawings, as you can see, heavy clothes, always dressed in rather gloomy dark green, heavy boots. And not only were the German people like that, according to Ancy, but also German professors. This is how a German professor looks, serious and ponderous, methodical, lacking real spark and imagination. And that showed in German science. Pursuing the caricature of the French philosopher Pierre Duhem, he drew on Pascal in distinguishing between what he called the esprit de finesse and the esprit géométrique, the geometrical spirit. Esprit de finesse, that sprang from a refined experience of the world gained through the senses. The esprit géométrique, that was founded in logic and abstraction. The former, esprit de finesse, was the French way, and the latter was the German way. And that was a German way that led to obscurity in science, prolixity, and all of it made worse by the heaviness of the German language. This is the Allied propaganda, of course. Well, you can see many gulfs being opened up here, essentially between the refined, light, creative Latin culture and the efficient, plodding culture of the North. And in some hands as well, there was the gulf between Catholic and Protestant, between Latin Catholicism and the German Protestant tradition. But whatever the cleavages, they suddenly made nonsense of the notion, that precious notion of the oneness of humanity, that notion that had been de rigueur in public debate, routine only a few weeks before. Well, with so many leading German scientists among the 93, how could the workings of science, in principle, as I've said already this week, in principle the most international, the most universal of all intellectual enterprises, how could the workings of science proceed? Well, science certainly couldn't go on as if nothing had happened. And for the duration of the war, and I have to say many years afterwards, the scientific world separated into two camps. The camp of Germany and the Central Powers, these were the German allies, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Kingdom of Bulgaria, the Ottoman Empire. That was one camp, and then the Allied camp, led at this time by Britain and France. And the two camps just abandoned any pretense of universalism. But there was another world out there, a world of declared neutrality, a world of declared detachment from the conflict. And that world was committed to business as usual. Now, for the sciences, nobody in that world was as or more prominent in the neutral camp than the Nobel Prize institution. Based in neutral Sweden, and the most potent symbol, I think, at this time, the most potent symbol of peace and understanding. Now, the Nobel Prizes were a characteristic product of the pre-war, turn-of-the-century internationalist spirit. They were established, there were 5 of them, under the will of the Swedish inventor and industrialist Alfred Nobel. And as Nobel's will stipulated, there were to be 5 prizes in the sciences, in physics, chemistry, and what was curiously called medicine or physiology. I don't know what, they obviously couldn't quite decide what to call it, I suppose. The physics and chemistry prizes, these were awarded essentially by a committee of the Royal Swedish Academy, the medical prize by a committee of the, usually called the Karolinska Institute, the Caroline Institute, which is the main medical school in Stockholm, and the Peace Prize was awarded by the Norwegian Parliament, and a literature prize, the prize for literature, also awarded from Sweden. Now, Nobel certainly created these prizes with peaceful internationalist intent, but implementation, as usual, wasn't so straightforward. First of all, there came a complaint from the family that the family had been deprived of its due inheritance by the amount of money that Nobel had siphoned off for his prizes. They protested in vain. There was also a protest or contest, perhaps, or discussion as to how the prizes should be awarded. Now, there were those in Sweden, including the King of Sweden, who thought the whole concept was far too international. Shouldn't the money actually go to Swedish science rather than to foreigners? Or if there had to be prizes, well, they should probably take less account of international developments in science, the growth of sophisticated laboratories and so on, but play to the traditional Swedish strengths in science, such as polar exploration. The polar explorer and geologist here, Adolf Erik Nordenskiöld, was certainly the king's model of what a Nordic scientist should be. Out on the ice, not in the lab, out on the ice, battling with the elements, doing the sort of science that only a Nordic scientist could do, of course. If you're in Spain, it's a bit difficult to do this sort of work. But in the end, the protesters gave up, and the prizes open to all, prizes without except consideration of nation, it had to be. That, though, still left ample scope for behind-the-scenes contention. The system of making nominations, of suggesting names, it just invited rivalry. Former prize winners could submit names, so could members of the Swedish Academy, so could certain professors in Nordic universities, and a number of professors in other countries, a few other countries as well. But that left the door wide open to feuding and lobbying, expressions of national interest, personal rivalries, the lot. And even among the Swedish scientists who chose the winners, I'm here actually limiting what I say to physics and chemistry, there was no consensus about what sort of sciences or what sort of scientific results should be honoured. In physics and chemistry, two main protagonists encapsulated the problem. On the left, Svante Arrhenius, who was a physical chemist, outgoing in personality, well-connected internationalist. He travelled a lot in Britain and the US. And on the right, Gösta Mittag-Leffler, who was a mathematician, no great traveller, frequently ill, in fact almost a perpetual invalid for long periods of his life. And his external sympathies, insofar as he had any, were pretty exclusively with Germany and perhaps secondarily with France. Arrhenius, again, an experimentalist, Mittag-Leffler, a theorist, and both men profoundly wedded to their views on what constituted good science. And there were many signs of disagreement, many signs of stalemate, if you look at the way the prizes were awarded in those early years. As the case of the hugely eminent Walter Nernst of Göttingen, the University of Göttingen, who had to be nominated, and I have to say, strongly nominated by, every year, strong, multiple nominations from outside, had to be nominated for 15 consecutive years before he was finally awarded the Nobel Prize for chemistry. It could equally well, actually, given his interest, have been in physics, but anyway, it was in chemistry in 1920. And contrast Nernst's protracted, repeated failure to receive the prize with the success of the Swedish inventor and industrialist Gustav Dalén. Dalén was the Nobel Prize winner for physics in 1912. And he was the winner on the basis of one rather limp nomination. And he was awarded the prize for the Dalén flasher, which will, in fact, I don't need to explain what the Dalén flasher was. Perhaps I will. This was a regulator that controlled the flow of acetylene gas in lighthouses. Now you'll remember that. In lighthouses, so the light could be turned off automatically in daytime. It was a very important energy-saving, cost-saving device, and important, obviously, for shipping and And it was very ingenious, but you wouldn't have thought at first sight it's quite Nobel Prize level stuff. But it's very difficult, and the leading historians of the Nobel Prize system, Robert Friedman and Elizabeth Crawford, they've both insisted how difficult it is to get at the mechanisms by which Nobel decisions were made. But domestic Swedish interest in this case would seem to have been pretty well at work. Now I say this not to ridicule the Nobel institution, but just, or certainly not to suggest that it was riddled with corruption. I don't want to say that. But just to try to convey again how difficult it was, time and again, to bring those frequently stated internationalist ideals to earth. And if it was difficult in peacetime, you know, we're talking Dahl and Flasher, we're talking about the pre-war case, if it was difficult in peacetime, how on earth was the Nobel mechanism, the Nobel culture of detachment and neutrality, how on earth was it going to work in the wake of the mass slaughter of World War I, made all the worse, and I would argue very significantly worse, by that declaration of the 93. Well, despite their own less than glorious record, the victorious Allies were in no mood for forgiveness. Universalist ideals were now cast to the winds, and Germany and the Central Powers were ostracized in science. They were excluded from international congresses. They were excluded from the new international body of representing the various scientific disciplines, the International Research Council. This is what became the International Council of Scientific Unions in later years. And the Allies determined that even the German language would be forbidden in international gatherings. Now that was an extraordinary decision, given the prominent and one would have to say in certain disciplines the dominant position of German language in science just before the World War I. If you look at chemical abstracts in the years leading up to the First World War, I mean, I just have some figures as it happens for 1909. If you look at the 1909 figures for chemical abstracts, 45% of the items cited there were from German publications and were in German. 45%. And just think of the more widely, if you like, the strength, the manifest strength of Germany across the board of the sciences. If you take the first 15 years of the Nobel Prizes from 1901, first award, up to 1915, 1/3 of all Nobel Prizes in science, including the medical prizes as well, that is 15 of them went to German scientists. The UK managed 7 and the United States 2. Well, from their neutral vantage point in Sweden and Norway, the Nobel committees rode resolutely against the vindictive tide. This is in the immediate post-war period. Of the 7 prizes in physics and chemistry awarded between 1918 and 1921, 5 went to Germans, and 1 of those went to the most contentious figure of all, Fritz Haber, in 1919. Now, Haber could say, as he did, during peacetime, a scientist belongs to the world, but during war he belongs to his country. Well, Haber certainly belonged to his country during the First World War. He was the great pioneer of gas warfare and was publicly known as that. And that, I think, made the award even more extraordinary. And there was an added extraordinary dimension as well, and that was that actually Haber had only received 1 nomination, and that was from a close colleague in Germany. In other words, he hadn't received the sort of whole slew of nominations which usually resulted, except in Darwin's case, I agree, I've already given a counterexample, but that usually led to the award of a Nobel Prize. So the only conclusion you can draw, and this is the conclusion drawn by Elizabeth Crawford and Robert Friedman, the only conclusion you can draw is that Haber was the Swedish Academy's choice, which meant essentially, given the makeup, the profile of Swedish society at the time, which meant essentially it was the choice of a conservative, rather light right-wing elite in Swedish society. Now, when challenged, as they were challenged, this elite said, well, we were just being neutral. You know, Nobel Prizes, they were meant to be awarded irrespective of nationhood and so on and so on and so on. So if there's been a war, okay, we just ignore that. This doesn't matter. And so to exclude Haber on the grounds that he had participated in the First World War with a rather central position, that is something that we simply would not take account of. So there's a sense in which it is quite high-minded internationalism. It's internationalism taken to its logical extremes, if you like. Well, the French were predictably horrified, and actually the Allies generally were horrified, and they reacted accordingly. In 1920, the Harvard chemist Theodore Richards, who'd won the chemistry prize in 1914, the Braggs, William, what's the son? William, Mary Jo, you're going to have to help me. Lawrence, of course. William and Lawrence, anyway, father and son. The Braggs, who'd won the physics prize, shared the physics prize in 1915. They all refused to attend the Nobel ceremony, as they'd been invited to do. And only one non-German scientist or Nobel Prize winner in the sciences, in fact, attended the ceremony, and that was Charles Bachler from the University of Edinburgh. He was said to have praised the German science in his address, in his Nobel lecture, and he had even, in public, shaken German hands. But there wasn't much other handshaking, I would have to say. On the contrary, exclusion, boycott, humiliation, that was the order of the day. The quite deliberate humiliation, for example, of the frail 88-year-old, ageing but very eminent astronomer, Wilhelm Forster. He was one of the 93. Forster had been a key figure in international science for many years before the First World War. He'd been a member of the International Committee of the Meter since it was set up in the 1870s. He'd been very prominent in the International Bureau of Weights and Measures, and indeed he was the president of the International Bureau of Weights and Measures from 1891 onwards. But when he arrived in Paris for the first post-war meeting of the Bureau in 1920, the other members refused to sit with him. And Forster had no choice but to resign. It was a sorry episode, I think, and for reasons I think I could go into in more detail, but I won't for the moment, I think a pretty shabby episode. And it was all, shabby or not, it was all strikingly short-sighted. Of course, you can understand the resolve of the French and the Belgians in particular to punish a country or to turn their gaze away from a country that had actually occupied and devastated much of their territory. But what authority could the new International Union for Chemistry, the International Union of Pure and Applied Chemistry, set up in 1920, what authority could an international union like that have when the world's leading nation in chemistry was excluded? Now, here in the US, French and Belgian determination to keep the Germans out of this, and indeed all other scientific unions, that determination here, on this side of the Atlantic, appeared mystifying. William Noyes, former president of the American Chemical Society, the first editor of Chemical Abstracts, very senior professor at the University of Illinois, and a very prominent figure internationally, campaigned tirelessly against this French-Belgian determination to keep Germany out. But there was no meeting of minds on that. The Rockefeller Foundation did what it could by maintaining at least some measure of support for German institutions, especially in the fields of public health. But the standoff remained really until the Locarno treaties. These are treaties that are signed round about the mid-20s, and they begin, I think, rather grudgingly and rather slowly, in fact, incompletely, to open the door to Germany's return to international science. But the French and the Belgians were resolved that that process of reintegration, which in principle was possible in the late 1920s, should proceed as slowly as possible. Now, the Allies' hard line on German participation in international meetings in many ways backfired. German scientists simply said, we've no reason to apologise. You know, their philosophy would be essentially Haber's philosophy. We served our country when our country needed us, and we behaved, in that respect, we behaved absolutely honourably. The Germans, though, were refused to apologise, and they simply went and made alternative arrangements. They turned eastwards. They turned partly to their former allies. They also turned to Soviet Russia. Now here, German influence and even German language survived perfectly well, disappearing very much in the Allied countries, but in those countries, particularly in Soviet Union, it survived perfectly well. A bilingual German-Russian journal was established. Medical reading rooms with German journals and German lectures and so on. They were opened in Moscow and St. Petersburg. A German bacteriological station was opened in Moscow, German-Soviet conferences, collaborations, and so on and so on and so on. All pretty well ignored, not known about almost, by the Allies. The Allies who were busy preening themselves, pursuing their own triumphalist agendas. And on that agenda, I'd say that a particularly satisfying one for the Allies, and especially for the French, was the recovery of Alsace and the parts of Lorraine that had been lost to Germany after the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. The jewel in this crown, in the Alsatian crown, was the city and University of Strasbourg. After the War of 1870, the Germans had developed the University of Strasbourg into a showpiece. It was one of the great universities of the world. It was a new university in more senses than one. It was an imperial university, not regional, which is very unusual in the German systems. It has no regional affiliation. It is a university directly answerable to the imperial administration. So it was imperial, not regional. And in that respect, it was a quite deliberate statement about the new Bismarckian Empire. The young, energetic, very able professors who were sent to chairs in Strasbourg after 1870, they were appointed to present the benign face of the empire, the German Empire, to a population that actually, of course, was by no means automatically won over to German rule after the War of 1870. This university was also unusual in that it broke with the old German Humboldtian idea of the seamless web of knowledge, the idea that in any university the sciences and the humanities and music and art and so on should somehow all be in a simple mix and that they should fertilize one another. That was totally abandoned in the University of Strasbourg. The emphasis there was on specialization. All the sciences each of the sciences had its own building. This was a researching university, and you take the Faculty of Science, for example, there were 7 essentially independent departments in the Faculty of Science, each with a palatial separate building, with an observatory, a very fine observatory on top, an observatory that housed, as you might sort of expect, the biggest telescope in the German Empire. And everything was of the grandest, everything was on the most sumptuous scale that you could imagine. Well, the recovery of the University of Strasbourg as the city, and the University of Strasbourg in particular, gave the French immense satisfaction. German professors were given 48 hours to pack up their belongings and to make off. They were just expelled immediately. And then, coming on to 1923, the French used what had now become a French showpiece, because they took over the University of Strasbourg and ran it as a French university. In 1923, they used what had become a French showpiece as the focus for a national celebration of the centenary of France's arguably greatest scientist, Pasteur. Well, this was, the Pasteur centenary was an event redolent with the idea that France was recovering from the shock of war. France was emerging again as a great international nation. There was a big celebration conference in Paris. There was a new biography of Pasteur that was commissioned and published. There was a play, this is the play by one of the most fashionable playwrights of the time, Sacha Guitry, and again presenting a very idealized view, a very favorable view of Pasteur's way to his discoveries. The Pasteur's birthplace in the Jura was was restored and open to the public. Statues sprouted everywhere. Even the first French commemorative stamps. These are the first stamps to commemorate any particular event, and the Pasteur stamp on the left was used with different denominations, was used for several years, right through into the early 1930s. So it wasn't just a fly-by-night commemorative stamp, it was a stamp that became the standard stamp for French postage. And in Strasbourg, where Pasteur had begun his academic career, which is one reason it justified the holding of the biggest of all the events to do with the Pasteur centenary there, in Strasbourg they inaugurated a monument in 1923. Here's the monument, this is the day of the inauguration, and if you look at it from another angle, you'll see that the monument is actually placed quite deliberately in front of the main entrance of the university, of what had been until 4 or 5 years later, 5 years earlier, had been a German university. It's not a pretty object, as most people felt, and you can imagine that when the Germans occupied Strasbourg again in 1940, one of their first acts was to blow it up. There were those who said this was one of the few good things that the Germans did during their reoccupation of Strasbourg. But that was the monument, and behind it you can see that's the main entrance to the university, and you can see it's got French flags and so on all over it. So a great event in 1923. 4 years later there were centenary commemorations, this time for another French hero, Marcelin Berthelot. He got a stamp in 1927. This is Berthelot, an organic chemist, on the right. Same profile, same ceremony, a biography, not a play this time, but a cantata by Paul Claudel, another very fashionable author at the time. This stamp, which also was used for several years, and as in the case of Pasteur, a great international conference, a gathering of 2,000 people or more in the Sorbonne, with, it's 1927, they were just having to rethink a little bit, so there was the odd German scientist allowed to appear, but not to appear as a main speaker. So they were kept in their place. And there were other celebrations, nationalistic celebrations in the 1920s. Ampere's house near Lyon was opened as a sort of scientific shrine in 1928, and there are other examples. Now, I find it striking that the French chose to promote their science through these various shows, these very expensive, very elaborate retrospective accounts, or retrospective honourings, if you like, of French scientists from the past. Statues, anniversaries, all that sort of thing. The Germans did far, far less of that. And instead the Germans developed other vehicles for their assertiveness. It's not that they lacked assertiveness, absolutely not, but they chose another genre, if you like. One that was particularly favoured was the new genre of national science museums. Now, the Science Museum was essentially a German creation, and the most famous of the science and technology museums of the 20th century, I suppose, is the Deutsches Museum, the German museum, in Munich. This was the creation of Oskar von Miller. Oskar von Miller was a very notable, high-profile electrical mechanical engineer. He's remembered for his dramatic demonstration of power transmission by high voltage alternating current at the International Electrical Exhibition of 1891 in Frankfurt. But for my purpose, I want to see von Miller as a committed internationalist. He was a great friend of Thomas Edison. He was much admired by Edison. He was, if you like, a German patriot. I think that's beyond question, but not in an exclusive way. He was certainly happy to see the foundation stone of the Deutsches Museum, as I say, essentially his creation, laid in 1903 by the Kaiser. Here's the Kaiser laying the foundation stone for the museum, surrounded by the Kaiser's family. There's Oskar von Miller is there lurking, keeping an eye on things at the back. And off picture there are children dressed in white robes, or little cheruby sort of children, giving the whole thing a very exotic air. So this was a great event, all the trappings of imperial Germany. So, you know, this is a national event. It's not just a little private Munich municipality event. It wasn't that at all. And von Miller, 2 decades later, in 1926, he was happy to see ceremony again when the museum finally moved into its permanent premises, the building where, if you know it, where it is now on the banks of the river, the main river running through Munich. And here there are people blacked up as miners, and it was this curious idea of carrying the aeroplane on top of this sort of representation of machinery. But that was the procession that led to the inauguration of the museum, the new museum buildings, in 1926. Remember, it's 1926. This is the time when the Germans, there's much talk of the Germans reintegrating in the international scientific community, and I think the date of this, the determination to actually move ahead with the new building in 1926 is related. It's not, at least it's not unrelated to that new departure. In the museum, Oskar von Miller was very happy to have installed the Ehrensaal, this sort of room, or almost like a chapel, almost like a shrine, this sort of room of honour for all the great scientists. And busts and portraits of great scientists were arranged round the sort of apse, if you like, of this little cathedral. Now, as you might have guessed, all the scientists were German. And the first non-German to be represented in the Ehrensaal was only a very few years ago, when Lavoisier was inducted. I also have to say that there were no women, and the first woman to be represented in the Ehrensaal was Lise Meitner, and again, obviously, many, many years after the Ehrensaal was inaugurated. But this is, again, I think the Ehrensaal, you can really see it as a declaration, a statement of German pride in Germany's science. Well, other countries followed suit. Science museums cropped up all over the place. Prague had its Science and Technology Museum in 1908. Vienna in 1908, although the building wasn't fully open until 1918. London 1909, and all these museums had a national tinge, but I think they were never aggressively exclusively nationalistic. After the war, I think, though, there was a change of tone. I want to say that it was not, I think the tone was not even now nationalistic, or at least strongly nationalistic, but it was certainly what I want to call patriotic. Governments now saw the museums as having a value that went beyond the purely educational. A Swedish working party, anxious to see what Sweden should do about having a museum, went to visit the Deutsches Museum soon after the war and was shocked to find that there was only one artifact in the whole museum that was Swedish, and that was a pair of Lapland snowshoes. And they went back hotfoot to Sweden, much patriotic indignation, and that led to the founding of the Swedish Technical Museum in 1926. Almost simultaneously, in Florence, the Museum of the History of Science was opened. Same aim of conveying a broad sweep of the history of science and technology, but with almost sacred objects, Italian objects of course, almost sacred objects littered about as highlights. One of Galileo's fingers, for example. Actually, 2 fingers and a thumb had been cut off Galileo's body when the body was reinterred in 1737. But one of the fingers and the thumb had disappeared. And it was only a very few years ago that they showed up. I mean, one hopes they're the real thing, but probably it doesn't really matter if they're not, but anyway. And only recently have they been reunited. So if you haven't been to the Museum of the History of Science in Florence for a few years, you should go, because now you will see 2 fingers and a thumb. And you see they now had to create another sort of way of demonstrating, of showing off this sacred object for veneration. In the same year, the year's significant. We're in 1927 thereabouts. This is the period of Mussolini. This is the rise of the fascist state in Italy. In Como, in northern Italy, they built a temple to house the remains of not the human remains, but the apparatus, the remaining apparatus of Alessandro Volta. This was another sort of shrine, a particularly elaborate one. There'd been an exhibition in, if you go here, actually, it's a bit disappointing museologically, because the problem is that in 1899 they'd had an exhibition, I think it probably was in Como as well, of the surviving apparatus of Volta, and during the exhibition hall burnt down. So all you've actually got in this temple, this grand temple, are the sort of charred remains of bits of voltaic apparatus. But, use a bit of imagination, you can see what it's all about. And of course that didn't matter too much, because it's the idea of having a national hero who was honoured in this very classical way, in this classical building. The British, well, you can guess who they went for. They went for James Watt. And his workshop from Heathfield, his workshop in Birmingham, had remained virtually locked up and unopened ever since his death. It was now lovingly transported. This is the workshop in its original location, and it was transported and brought to the Science Museum in London. The untidiness, the grubbiness of it all, they were carefully preserved. And I think it's clear that even in the Science Museum, in London, which has always prided itself on being supranational, you can see even in the Science Museum, you can see that the collection is edging towards being more patriotic, more British-centred. I think there are reasons for that beyond patriotism, but I won't digress on that. Now, I think this kind of mild boosterism tells you a lot about the post-war faltering of the Universalist ideals. But it was pretty harmless stuff. I would insist that it was mild boostering. In the wrong hands, though, you can see what a dangerous track you're beginning to go down, because in totalitarian hands it could become seriously distorting, even malign. And I think that as governments recognise, as they clearly did after the war, as they recognise the potential of museums for promoting national pride, for promoting commercial interests, trade interests, and I think that they did by the 1930s certainly, then I think you could see mild boosterism turning into something more aggressive. When Hitler looked at the Oscar von Miller's Deutsches Museum, he found the tone and the focus far too international. It didn't convey enough of the genius of the German nation. And Hitler saw the limitations of a museum that was really deeply embedded. I mean, Oscar von Miller, yes, okay, it had a German sort of slant, there's no doubt about that. But, you know, it was a museum deeply embedded, really, in international ideas and international practices. That's where Miller came from, as an international, or an engineer of international standing. Hitler, though, didn't see it, saw things differently. His clear preference was for a second museum, and he urged that a second museum should be built on the other side of the river, and that should be a museum of German technology, German industry. But of course he had a few other things on his mind at the time, and that second museum was never built. It would have been interesting, it would have been lamentable, but it would have been interesting to see what you'd put in it, I think. And instead he decided he would more keep an eye on the Deutsches Museum, see if he could edge the Deutsches Museum towards a more German-oriented tone. And so, on his request, the car in which he drove to the Nuremberg rally was displayed. Not a particularly interesting technological artifact, but of course historically curious. Oh yes, there was also the spade that he'd used in cutting the first sod for one of the big autobahns in Germany. I mean, again, you know, this is a science and technology museum being blatantly, flagrantly used for the promotion of a particular national political agenda. And then, I think most notoriously, two exhibitions at the Deutsches Museum, in the library of the Deutsches Museum. First of all, this one on the dangers of Bolshevism. That was in 1936. And that's the cathedral of Munich being burnt by the Bolshevik torch. And the Eternal Jew. This was in 1937. To this one, people crowded in. 5,000 people a day over 3 months, 500,000 visitors. And that wasn't all, because after it had closed, after 3 months in Munich, it went on to Vienna and eventually ended up in Berlin, always, of course, whipping up anti-Semitic feeling, just as it was intended to do. I mean, there's the money, you recognise the symbols, there's the money, the width of domination. There is, of course, the hammer and sickle, because one of the main themes of these two exhibitions was that the two dangers, the dangers of Bolshevism on the one side, on the one hand, and of the Jewish International on the other, they were in effect one and the same thing. And it's very interesting that in the Jewish exhibition, it seems that Trotsky somehow embodied both of the evils and was seen as a particular, or was presented as a particular villain. Now, I think for all its imperfections and its concealed tensions, the rhetoric of universalism, the old rhetoric of universalism, might have imposed some restraint, some constraint on such explicitly racial divisiveness. But, as I've tried to suggest during the week, universalism had, for a long time, been faltering. It was having difficulties. And I think its ideals, the ideals of the universal, they were no match for resolute totalitarianism. And I think that was, this conflict, I think, was something that was sort of looming and came to a head in the 1930s. I'd say that it came to a head very conspicuously at one of the international exhibitions, one that I didn't mention on Wednesday. This is the 1937 Paris Exposition, the International Exhibition of Arts and Techniques in Modern Life. Now, those internationalist, universalist ideals, they were just swept aside in a remarkable physical expression of ideological opposition between the two dominant totalitarian powers, namely Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. The German pavilion, first of all. Modernist in some ways, the simplicity, lack of decoration, but I'll have a comment to make about the modernism, I think, in a moment. It was carefully designed under Hitler's supervision. This is Hitler talking to the architect, who was Albert Speer, who designed the Nuremberg rally grounds. Here you have Speer showing off his plan for the German pavilion to Hitler. It was tall. It was easily, of course, the tallest building in the exhibition. It was modernist up to a point, I think, by virtue of its simplicity. But I think actually, if you can look, obviously I've not seen it, but if you can look from accounts, if you look at the detailing on the outside, you will find quite elaborate decoration, mainly around the design of the swastika. Inside, it was fairly simple. It was one simple gallery. You have at various points wonders of German technology on display. This is a plan, actually, it's a model of the Nuremberg rally grounds. Sort of nothing aggressively modernist, I think. And indeed what you can see here, I think, in the German conception of the image it wanted to convey in 1937 is a sort of tempered adoption of modernity. If you look at these pictures, for example, these pictures along the walls, they are almost entirely devoted to rustic scenes, to calming scenes, that are showing the healthiness, the naturalness, the joie de vivre of the German people. And so it was very much geared to show that Germany, Nazi Germany, could be modern, could be progressive in technology especially, but without embracing all the evils and all the constraints of international capitalism, by which, of course, that was the veiled terminology for Jewish capitalism. Well, that was the German pavilion. This is the Soviet pavilion. Somewhat similar, just tall, simple lines. Not so tall as the German pavilion, I have to say, and that did worry the Soviets, but that's how it turned out. And the Soviet pavilion, as you can see, is topped with this immense statue. You know, compared with the German eagle, who's just sort of sitting rather modestly on the top of the German pavilion, these two, it's a worker and a female peasant, they were actually absolutely gigantic. Inside, well, you can see a contrast, I think. This is inside the German gallery, and it shows a Mercedes racing car, very much latest, state-of-the-art, very expensive, handmade, for breaking records and that sort of thing. And in the Soviet pavilion, you have another car displayed, which is a people's car. Not that I suspect many people actually had one, but in principle that was the people's car. And these two buildings were set opposite each other in the exhibition grounds, and they faced each other doing battle. And this is a cartoon that appeared in a newspaper at the time of the exhibition. Here's the Soviet pavilion, here's the German pavilion, and as you can see there, hammer and tongs at each other's throats. So much so that people down at the bottom are despairing and throwing themselves in the river in despair. You know, they're desperate to have another war. And so people found that the only solution they had was to jump off the bridge. So visitors looked on in disbelief at what was happening. There's a famous photograph looking from the Chaillot Hill, if you know that, looking down on the exhibition grounds. On the left, the German gallery, the German pavilion. On the right, the Soviet pavilion. And in the middle, looking a bit uncomfortable, I think, is the Eiffel Tower. And many people said, well, many people who, in a way, either admired one or the other version of totalitarianism. I mean, obviously opinion was divided on which one you choose, but plenty of people actually felt there was a vigour about these new powers and that France might have something to learn from them. And it was quite often said that the Eiffel Tower symbolised old technology. You know, the Eiffel Tower, after all, by 1937, it's nearly 50 years old. So this was the technology of the past. And perhaps France was a culture of the past. Perhaps it was part of an old world order that it was time to do away with. Well, the French government was troubled by what was going on, as you can imagine. All the more so because the party in power at this time, in 1937, is the left-wing Popular Front. And it's a very peculiar phase, I think, in the Popular Front's history. It's a phase in which the Popular Front was in a period of appeasement with regard to Germany. And so the French welcomed the German pavilion with its naked National Socialist messages. In fact, there's evidence of behind-the-scenes negotiation which fixed it for the French to have the slightly higher pavilion. It was known that they were going to be opposite each other, and of course the Germans wanted to have the higher one, which, as you can see, they achieved. And there is some suggestion that even though the plans in principle were submitted independently, each country not knowing what any other country was going to do, there is the suggestion that actually the Germans knew, and Albert Speer, he knew what the Soviets were up to and wanted to outdo them. In a way, I suppose you could say he did. Well, you had to be monumentally blind not to see what lay ahead. Monumentally blind not to see how the old tradition of universal exhibitions was being manipulated, distorted for nationalistic ends. Well, somebody who did spot what was going on was Mussolini. He was anything but blind. And so immediately after the 1937 exhibition in Paris, he put forward plans for an Italian exhibition to take place in 1942. Notice, universal, the universal exhibition. All nations would be invited to come to Rome for this great exhibition. And interestingly, one of the main features was going to be this gigantic arch, and you would be able to go up in the arch and around the top. I can't imagine quite how you'd have done it, but that was how it was conceived. And here, I think, more obviously even than in Paris, you do have some modernist buildings of real note, because before the war started, and indeed even through to about 1941, Mussolini was still building the exhibition grounds. And so these are some of the buildings that still exist to this day. You can still see them. I think this is probably the most famous, the most striking of all of them. Modernist in that sense, international. Modernism was always associated with internationalism. But if you look at the inscription on the top, you can see that it's all about Italian thinkers and scientists and navigators and all that sort of thing, sort of just Italian heroes. That's what the inscription's all about. So, well, it never happened, 1942, for obvious reasons. There was going to be one other thing that actually happened fairly recently, I believe, was an obelisk in honour of Marconi has recently been, or fairly in recent years, has been completed. This is the Marconi obelisk. I think it was started for the 1942 exhibition, but was, like so much else, was left unfinished. Well, was that the end of the story of Universalist ideals? Had they just been shown up as unrealisable dreams, the dreams of Paul Otlet, the bibliographer, the dreams of the conceivers of universal exhibitions, the dreams of Alfred Nobel, who wanted to create these international prizes? Well, I think what you have to say is that universalism had had a very rough time. But what's striking, and I say this in conclusion, is internationalism's, universalism's resilience, its capacity to spring back just when you think it's beaten. Took another battering, of course, in World War II, but it resurfaced after the war in the form of UNESCO. You could say that UNESCO's taken a battering, not least from the British and I think the Americans, who tended to view UNESCO with suspicion. I think rather like the King of Sweden in Britain, we've tended to think that any resources that were spent should be spent on us, on the home front, rather than internationally. So we squabble, we try to promote our favourite locations. We sort of engage with UNESCO now, I think, in Britain, in trying to promote various World Heritage sites that we'd like to be approved. So we get interested in UNESCO now, but I never have the feeling that we're wholeheartedly engaged with it. But UNESCO is still there. It has 195 members. It's still promoting what it calls international peace and universal respect for human rights. International, universal, in there in the Declaration. And I like to see that as a sign that however battered it may be, however battered universalist ideals are, I think they will always be with us. At least, to conclude, I say, I hope so.